Imagine a humble man, a shepherd and fig cultivator, an inhabitant of a quiet village far from the centers of power. He possessed no titles, was not scholarly in the scriptures, nor did he frequent the circles of the elite of his time. However, suddenly, this common individual is called by God for an extraordinary assignment: to confront kings and religious leaders, denounce iniquities, and announce a divine judgment that no one wished to hear. This is Amos, a prophet who emerged from the anonymity of Tekoa to become one of the most potent and challenging voices in the biblical narrative. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional biblical accounts and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any content. Amos was a native of Tekoa, a tranquil village in the heart of Judah. The surrounding landscape was composed of vast fields, golden hills under the scorching sun, and wild fig trees that swayed lazily in the breeze. It was a land of shepherding, accustomed to the simple rhythm of rural life. In that almost forgotten corner, no one would suppose that a man destined to be one of the most challenging voices of his time was being formed there. From an early age, Amos lived a routine that seemed immutable. He cared for his family's flock, guiding the sheep along the slopes, always vigilant. When he was not in the field, he dedicated himself to cultivating sycamore trees, trees that demanded meticulous care to bear fruit. Young Amos, with calloused hands and a penetrating gaze, learned to listen to the sounds of nature and to understand its signs. Anyone who observed him would see nothing more than a common shepherd, perhaps even somewhat reclusive, oblivious to the great cities and their turmoil. But there was something singular about Amos, even if he was not yet fully aware. His eyes carried a restlessness, a keen perception of the injustices that at times reached even the most remote corners of Tekoa. Upon hearing the reports that travelers brought about Samaria and its riches, about the oppression of the poor and the greed of the wealthy, he felt something distinct, an indignation that stole his peace. While the world followed its course, a greater voice, silent but unmistakable, began to form within him. It was as if the wind that swept the hills carried with it a divine whisper, a calling that he still did not fully comprehend. Until one day, that silence was broken, and in a way that Amos would never imagine. That day seemed identical to all the others. The sun slowly rose on the horizon, tinging the sky with orange and golden tones, while Amos led his flock along the slopes. The clanging of the sheep's bells mingled with the rustling of the leaves and the timid song of the birds. Everything seemed so serene, so predictable, but something was about to happen, something that would forever alter the destiny of that man. It was while he was alone, observing the flock, that Amos felt the call. It was not an audible voice, one that is answered with words. It was more like a weight in his heart, a warmth that ran down his spine and seemed to fill his entire being. It was as if the wind, blowing through the trees, was laden with something beyond mere air, a presence, an urgency. Amos, who had never considered himself special, realized that God was communicating with him. God did not call him for a trivial task. He, a simple man, accustomed to the silence of the fields and manual labor, was sent to speak on behalf of the Creator himself. And it would not be a gentle message. Amos was to address the kingdom of Israel, to the north, and confront the powerful with severe words. He was to denounce the injustices, avarice, and corruption that reigned there. Imagine the weight of this mission, an anonymous shepherd without titles or status, being sent to confront monarchs and priests. Amos knew it would be an arduous journey. He possessed no formal training, nor eloquence. "I am just a herdsman," he may have thought, but there was no room for refusal. When God calls, even the simplest of men is capable of great deeds. Amos left behind the fields of Tekoa and began his journey northward, not knowing exactly what he would encounter. The kingdom of Israel awaited him, prosperous in appearance but rotten inside, and Amos carried the message that would be like thunder breaking the false silence of that place. The road to the kingdom of Israel was long and full of uncertainties. Amos walked, carrying with him only the essentials: his staff, the experience accumulated in the fields, and the conviction that he was obeying the divine call. As he approached, the reports about Israel became clearer and more disturbing. The kingdom was prosperous more than Judah could conceive. The cities overflowed with sumptuous palaces, bustling markets, and grand festivities. But behind this superficial brilliance, Amos heard stories of oppression, corruption, and a hollow religiosity, which served more as a spectacle than as genuine devotion. When he arrived, the contrast impacted him. Samaria, the capital, shone with the ostentation of the elite. The main thoroughfares were a parade of fine fabrics, glittering jewels, and the laughter of those who seemed to possess everything. But it was enough to look away to the darker alleys, and one would see another reality. Poor people crushed by misery, slaves exhausted by work, and hungry children. Amos did not need much time to realize what was wrong. The rich lived as if they were untouchable, taking advantage of the arduous labor of the less favored. Justice, which should be a universal right, had transformed into a privilege for a few. Religion, which should be the moral foundation of the people, was a farce. The altars were full of valuable offerings, but hearts were empty of repentance. The people of Israel had moved away from God, exchanging true worship for pompous and convenient rituals. Amos saw all this and felt that his message would not only be difficult to hear, it would be like an exposed blade before a people who preferred to close their eyes. As he walked the streets of Samaria, hearing the buzz of the markets and the chants coming from the temples, Amos knew that his moment was approaching. He did not know exactly how or when it would begin, but one thing was certain. His voice, laden with truth, would soon echo like thunder in the palaces and squares of that prosperous but morally sick kingdom. The opportunity to speak arose faster than Amos expected. He was in Samaria, surrounded by the city's opulence, when he began to proclaim his message. There were no ceremonies or elaborate preparations. Amos simply raised his voice, and it was as if heaven itself roared. He began with words that no one could ignore. "The Lord will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem." It was like thunder splitting the air. Passers-by stopped to listen, more out of curiosity than reverence. After all, who was that man dressed as a shepherd, daring to speak with such authority? Amos's words were direct, without circumlocution. He spoke about the neighboring nations, condemning their injustices and cruelties. The people of Israel listened with a certain satisfaction, as it seemed he was attacking their enemies. But then, like the roar of a lion changing direction, Amos pointed his finger at Israel. His voice became even more intense, more urgent. He began to denounce the rich who exploited the poor, the leaders who transformed justice into merchandise, the priests who made religion a theater. "You who trample the poor and take grain taxes from him, you have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink wine from them." The words cut like blades, revealing truths that everyone knew, but no one wanted to admit. It was as if Amos were tearing away the veil that hid the kingdom's rot. He spoke with a force that did not come from him, but from God, and every phrase seemed to echo in the inner being of those who listened. Some looked at each other, uncomfortable. Others whispered, trying to diminish the importance of that simple man. But Amos continued undisturbed. He knew that his message was a warning, a last call for Israel to change its ways. And his words, though difficult to hear, were only the beginning. While Amos' words still reverberated through the streets of Samaria, something deeper began to happen. God did not only give him words to speak, but also images that spoke for themselves, like living visions that pulsed before his eyes. The first came as a verdant field that seemed prosperous and full of life, but suddenly, a cloud of locusts arose, devouring everything in its path. Nothing was left, neither food nor hope. Amos felt the weight of that scene. He knew what it meant. Israel was on the brink of losing everything. Amos could not contain his outcry. He interceded, asking God to have mercy, not to completely destroy the people. And, for an instant, it seemed that God had listened. But the visions continued. In the next one, fire arose, not a common fire, but something that consumed even the deep, drying up the rivers and burning the land down to the roots. It was terrifying, almost suffocating, as if Amos could feel the heat on his skin. Again he cried out, imploring for clemency, but God was showing the gravity of the situation, something that could no longer be ignored. The third vision was strangely simple, but laden with meaning. Amos saw God holding a plumb line, that small instrument used by builders to ensure that a wall was built straight. But the plumb line was in the Creator's hands, and he was using it to measure Israel. The message was clear. The people were crooked, out of alignment. God, the architect of the universe, would not tolerate a moral edifice about to collapse. Amos's words were like an axe cutting the roots of Israel's arrogance, and this bothered many people. Among those who felt threatened was Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. He was a powerful man, someone who represented the kingdom's official religion. For Amaziah, the temple of Bethel was more than a place of worship. It was a symbol of control and prestige. But now that prophet coming from the south was shaking the structures, denouncing everything as false and corrupt. Amaziah knew he had to act, and fast. The priest tried to disqualify Amos in every possible way. First, he sent a message to King Jeroboam, warning that Amos's prophecies were dangerous. He said, "Amos has conspired against you in the midst of the house of Israel. The land is not able to bear all his words." Amaziah wanted to make it seem that the prophet was a political threat, someone who was sowing revolt in the kingdom. But Amos was not intimidated. He knew that his mission came from God and not from the hands of men. When the political pressure did not work, Amaziah confronted Amos directly. He tried to disdain him, as if his humble origins were cause for contempt. "Go, you seer, flee to the land of Judah. There eat bread, and there prophesy. But never again prophesy at Bethel, for it is the king's sanctuary and it is the temple of the kingdom." But Amos's words were like an unshakable rock. He looked at Amaziah and replied firmly, "I was no prophet, nor was I a son of a prophet, but I was a herdsman and a tender of sycamore fruit. Then the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said to me, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" It was a powerful declaration. Amos was not there by his own choice, nor out of ambition. He had been sent, and nothing, not even Amaziah, could divert him from his mission. But tensions continued to grow. The opposition to the prophet was increasingly strong, and the people were beginning to be divided between those who rejected him and the few who dared to listen to him. Amos's words, as sharp as blades, continued to echo through the palaces and markets of Israel. He stood up in the squares and said things that no one had the courage to say. One day, looking directly at the rich merchants who showed off their expensive robes, Amos began to speak with a tone that mixed indignation and sorrow. "Hear this word, you cows of Bashan," referring to the women of Samaria's elite. It was a bold, almost provocative metaphor, comparing them to the fat cows that grazed in the region of Bashan, known for their opulence. They lived in comfort, but at the expense of exploiting the poor. Amos described scenes of greed and oppression with impressive clarity. He spoke of dishonest scales in the markets, of merchants who reduced the amount of wheat sold while increasing the price. He said that even the sweepings of the wheat, which should be discarded, were sold to the poorest as if they were food. And he didn't stop there. With a firm voice, he pointed his finger at the religious leaders who held great ceremonies at the altars of Bethel and Gilgal, but whose hearts were far from God. I despise your feast days," Amos proclaimed, and the shock was palpable. He said that the sacrifices and songs that filled the temple were useless because they did not come from a just heart. Instead, he cried out, "But let justice run down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." It was a powerful image, a metaphor that compared the true will of God to a torrential river which purifies and renews. The silence of the crowds was sometimes interrupted by uncomfortable murmurs or nervous laughter. Amos's message was becoming unbearable for the powerful, but he knew he had to continue. There was more to be said, more to be revealed. Amos continued to speak, even in the face of resistance. He knew that his words were harsh, but he also knew that God never sent a warning without a promise of hope. In the midst of his prophecies about destruction and judgment, Amos began to reveal something different. He spoke of a restoration, of a time when things would be put in place. It was as if, amidst the darkness of a starless night, he showed a glimmer of light on the horizon. "On that day," he said, "I will raise up the tabernacle of David which has fallen down." It was a vision full of meaning. The tabernacle of David, a symbol of a simpler time and a purer relationship with God, would be restored. It would not be a temple of cold stones, but something alive, full of life and communion. Amos's words painted images that touched the heart, even of the most hardened. He spoke of vineyards full of fruit, of fertile fields, where the grain would be so abundant that the reapers would barely be able to keep up. The days of famine and scarcity would be replaced by a time of celebration and plenty. But that was not all. Amos also spoke of a gathered people. Those who had been scattered, who had lost their roots, would be brought back. They would rebuild the destroyed cities, plant gardens, and live in peace. It was a promise that seemed impossible to many. After all, the reality before them was one of inequality, oppression, and imminent judgment. However, Amos' words were like a seed planted in hard ground, waiting for the right moment to germinate. Even as Amos brought this vision of hope, he knew that resistance continued to grow. People were restless, the powerful more irritated, and while he spoke about a distant and restored future, the immediate reality was one of danger and uncertainty. His mission was reaching a critical point, and the silence that was approaching seemed even more terrifying than his words. After everything that was said, all the visions shared, and the truths proclaimed, Amos began to move away from the center of attention. His mission seemed to be coming to an end, but not because he had given up or lost his strength. It was as if somehow he knew that he had already said everything he needed to say. The words that once roared like a lion now gave way to a silence that carried a weight greater than any discourse. The people who heard him were divided. Some still discussed his words, trying to understand what those promises and warnings meant. Others, especially the powerful, preferred to pretend that none of it mattered. "Who is he after all?" they said to each other, trying to discredit the prophet who was returning to the ways of Judah. But the truth is that Amos's impact was already engraved. His words continued to echo, like waves that could not be contained. The absence of details about Amos's final days only increases the mystery. He simply disappears from the pages of history, leaving no records of how his life ended. Perhaps he returned to the fields of Tekoa to tend his sheep and the sycamore trees, living out his remaining days in peace. Or perhaps he continued to proclaim his message, even in places where few could hear him. What we know is that the silence that followed was not an end, but an interval. It was as if his absence was part of the plan, a space left blank for the people to reflect and decide what to do with everything that had been said. Even so, Amos' story was not erased. His words remained alive, passing from generation to generation as a reminder of what justice, integrity, and the courage to obey God's call mean. Amos's words, although initially rejected by many, continued to spread like seeds scattered to the wind. His message, although simple in its essence, contained a power so profound that it could not be ignored. Every sentence carried the strength of a conviction that came directly from God. He was not a common man. Even without titles or prophetic lineage, he left a mark that crossed generations. It was as if his story echoed beyond his own life, always challenging and inspiring. As time passed, the truths that Amos proclaimed became impossible to forget. The image of the plumb line, the river of justice, the cows of Bashan, all these metaphors were engraved on the people's memory, serving as mirrors for a society that desperately needed change. And not only in Israel, but everywhere where injustice and hypocrisy threatened to obscure God's will. Amos showed us that true worship is not in grandiose ceremonies or decorated temples, but in justice flowing like a river, in righteousness being practiced as a lifestyle. His voice was raised for those who had no voice, for the poor and oppressed who were exploited by the powerful. He personified the courage that is born from God's call, the courage to tell the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. To this day, Amos's legacy lives on, not only in his words, but in every act of justice, in every gesture of kindness that reflects God's heart. His story is a reminder that transformation begins in unexpected places, often with ordinary people. And as we reflect on his life, we ask ourselves what we are doing so that the river of justice continues to flow. Perhaps, like Amos, we are being called to something greater, something that requires courage and faith to be fulfilled. And thus, his story intertwines with ours, inviting us to listen, act, and transform the world around us. Amos' story ends as it began, without great fanfare, but with a force that transcends time. He was just a shepherd, a man with calloused hands and feet marked by the dust of field work, but he was chosen to carry a message that would shake a kingdom, not for his eloquence or position, but for his obedience and faith. And that is what makes his trajectory so powerful. Amos reminds us that God does not choose the equipped, he equips the chosen. From the hills of Tekoa to the squares of Samaria, Amos carried a lesson that echoes to this day. True worship of God is in acts of justice and kindness. No matter how many songs we sing or how many altars we build, if our heart is not upright and our actions are not just, all of it is empty. He teaches us that faith is not something comfortable, but a call to face the most difficult realities, even if it means opposing what is popular or convenient. Furthermore, Amos challenges us to see the invisible. He spoke for the poor, the oppressed, the forgotten. He showed us that ignoring injustice does not exempt us from our responsibility. On the contrary, it makes us complicit in it. His cry for a river of justice and a stream of righteousness was not just a cry to Israel, but a call to all of us, in any time or place. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson of all. God can use anyone, anywhere, to fulfill his purposes. The only requirement is that we are willing to listen and act. Just like Amos, we can be a voice for those who have no voice, a channel for justice to flow. The question that remains is, are we ready to say yes to the call even if it leads us down difficult paths? Because as Amos showed us, it is in that yes that the stories that truly matter begin. If you liked the story of the prophet Amos and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.